In his second attempt to find a nominee who would be confirmed by the US Senate to replace the retired or resigned liberal Associate Justice of the US Supreme Court, Abe Fortas, President Nixon nominated in January 1970 Harold Carswell, who was born in December 1919 and died in July 1992, aged 72. He had served as a private attorney. In 1948, had unsuccessfully sought a seat in the Georgia state legislature, and then had gone on to serve as a United States Circuit Judge of the United States Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit and a United States District Judge of the United States District Court for the Northern District of Florida. So at issue were his racial views, because during his unsuccessful candidacy for the Georgia state legislature in 1948, he claimed that racial segregation was supposedly the only orderly way. These were not his exact words, but I think the thought was that. I try to quote freely from the late US President Richard Nixon's memoirs entitled simply RN. So the most only orderly or sensible or organized way in which different races could live together. I have always so believed, and I will always so believe. So this came up in the nomination battle in the US Supreme Court, as well as the fact that 58% of his decisions as a district court judge, in other words, over half, had been reversed. Feminists such as US Congresswoman Patsy Mink of Hawaii and Betty Friedan accused him of being an opponent of women's rights. And on learning of Carswell's 1948 racist comments, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the main organization of civil rights organization of African Americans, decided to oppose him as well. Then he was also accused of being a mediocre justice, but US Senator Roman Hruska, a Nebraska Republican, tried to defend him, claiming that also mediocre judges and people, lawyers, who were many, were entitled to a little representation. We can't have all Brandeises and Frankfurters and Cardozos, citing three famous and allegedly excellent, or even probably factually excellent, justices of the US Supreme Court. US Attorney General or Justice Minister, to use the parliamentary language, John Mitchell, was willing to forgive Judge Carswell his earlier racist views, stating that it was unfair to criticize Carswell for political remarks made 22 years ago. As had been the case in November 1969, in the effort to confirm Clement Haynsworth to the US Supreme Court, the two parties of the US Senate were deeply divided. 45 senators, including 17 Democrats and 28 Republicans, voted for Carswell, while 38 Democrats and 13 Republicans, so a total of 51, voted against him. On hearing about the result of the vote, President Nixon accused Democrats of having an anti-Southern bias as a result, saying that he had reluctantly concluded that it was impossible to get confirmation for the judge on the Supreme Court of any man who believes in the strict construction of the Constitution, as I do if he happens to come from the South. The strict construction view believes that the judges should interpret the Constitution, in this case the US Constitution, as closely to its original meaning and its author's intentions as possible. This view, of course, has been challenged by those of a more liberal judicial philosophy, claiming that it amounts to harboring, also already in the case of the US Supreme Court, attitudes of which are over 200 years old and which fail to take into account the huge transformations that there have been politically, technologically, economically, in terms of the two genders, in terms of the so-called sexual minorities, in terms of the religious groups, in terms of the ethnic groups and racial groups and so forth. And even in terms of, for example, the size of the electorate. 1 week after the Senate had rejected Judge Carswell's nomination to the US Supreme Court, President Nixon proceeded to nominate Minnesota Judge Harry Blackmun, who was a fellow Republican and whom he believed to be sufficiently conservative to move the court's center of ideological and judicial gravity to the right, and who also, according to his estimate, was close enough in his judicial philosophy to a fellow Minnesota judge, the then new Chief Justice of the US Supreme Court, Warren Burger, who had been nominated and confirmed in 1969, but who actually during his 24 years on the US Supreme Court turned out to become a rather liberal justice. And he actually authored the Roe versus Wade decision, whereby the US Supreme Court legalized in 1973 abortion during the first 3 months of a woman's or a girl's pregnancy. And already in May 1970, Blackmun was confirmed with 94 senators voting for him and none against him. By that time, Carswell had already resigned from his judicial position to run for the Republican nomination for the US Senate from Florida. His opponent was US Representative William Kramer. Expecting to benefit politically in Florida from Judge Carswell's rejection to the Supreme Court, aides of either Governor Claude Kirk Jr. or US Senator Edward Gurney urged Carswell to resign from the bench to run for the Senate seat being vacated by the long-term Democrat Spessard Holland. And Kramer even claimed that Gurney had, in a 1968 gentleman's agreement, agreed to support him for the seat. Carswell himself said that he ran for the Senate because he wanted to confront the liberals who had shot him down. But Kramer nevertheless defeated Carswell with over 220,000 votes compared to over 221,000 votes, with businessman George Ballmer receiving over 10,000 votes. Kramer himself was defeated by 54% to 46% by the Democrat Lawton Chiles of Lakeland in a heavily Democratic year. Lawton Chiles would later serve as a two-term Georgia governor. To be succeeded, I think he died in office just weeks before he was to retire from office in January 1999, and then he was succeeded by Jeb Bush, a son of former US President George Herbert Walker Bush, and a brother of former US President George W. Bush. In 1976, Carswell was convicted of battery for advances he made to an undercover police officer in a Tallahassee men's room. In September 1979, Carswell was attacked and beaten by a man whom he had invited to his Atlanta, Georgia hotel room in similar circumstances. And because of these incidents, Keith Stern, author of Queers in History, alleges Carswell to have been the first homosexual or bisexual nominated to the Supreme Court. However, there is no firm proof to support such allegations. Carswell practiced law privately before retiring, and in 1992 he died of lung cancer.